I'd like us to see it as this crucible in which the country was created, but also the problems and the differences and the controversies that we face today also were created then. And if we go back to that origin time, that origin point, I think we can start to untangle some of the differences that divide citizens today. So I'm just a big believer in going back to the beginning, going back to the origin, going back to, how did this all get started? I write about archaeology as well, and I'm fascinated with in the Middle East. When did humans first begin to build cities and why? Um, you know,
Today we're joined by Andrew Lawler, an award winning journalist and author known for uncovering compelling untold stories throughout history. His work has appeared in the New York Times, National Geographic, Science, and numerous other publications. Andrew's books, which he has written four of them now, have taken readers from the mysteries of lost colonies to the buried history beneath Jerusalem. His latest book, A Perfect Frenzy, which releases in Jan 2025, explores a fresh perspective on the American Revolution through the lens of Virginia's role in 1775. I enjoyed this conversation with Andrew and I learned more about the American Revolution than I knew of previously. I hope you enjoy the show and do listen till the very end. All right, welcome to the show, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here. Your new book, A Perfect Frenzy, releases tomorrow. How are you feeling about it?
well, it's a little bit like birthing a baby. It takes a long time to gestate, and you never know how it's going to be received in the world. But I'm pretty confident. Just got a New York Times review a few hours ago that was quite good, and I'm looking forward to getting out on the road and talking about a fresh way to think about the American Revolution. Now that we're at the 250th anniversary of the Revolution's start.
Before we dive into the book, you've written many other topics. You've written four books. This is your fourth book. From lost colonies to chicken's impact on the civilization. So, like, what draws you to these diverse historical narratives?
Uh, Well, I get bored easily. And so I've got to find a topic that is fresh, that feels like it hasn't been trampled over by a hundred other authors or journalists. And I've been lucky enough to find these stories that tend to be about ordinary things or myths or mysteries that haven't really gotten full attention. So I dive into these in a rather obsessive fashion and come back up with a book.
Nice. So, would you want to share a little bit more about your new book? Give an overview before we like really dive into a little bit more topics that are covered in the book.
Certainly. And I have a copy here, fresh off the press, coming out tomorrow, as you mentioned. And this is a story. It's called A Perfect Frenzy: A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. Now, most of your listeners probably know something about Lexington and Concord, the first battles of the American Revolution that happened in 1775. So that's 250 years ago this spring. And I'm interested in another piece that really hasn't gotten much attention, and that is what was going on in the South, in the Southern colonies at that time. And I began to dig into this for some very personal reasons and came up with what I think is a really fresh way of understanding how the nation was born.
So, I think you talk a lot about Virginia in the book. So, like, what role did Virginia play in the revolution, and what inspired you to explore Virginia's role in particular in the American Revolution?
Well, as I mentioned, this is a very personal endeavor. I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a port city uh, in the state, and I was aware of history there. We were a history-minded family, read a lot of history books, went to visit historical sites, It was part of our language in our family. So I thought that I knew what happened during the American Revolution in southeastern Virginia in the 1770s. And then one day I took my mother, actually, it was during the pandemic. She lives in Norfolk. I took her up to Williamsburg, the old colonial capital, just to do a little visit, get her out of the apartment. And I picked up a book in a bookstore about Lord Dunmore. Now, Lord Dunmore was the last royal governor of Virginia. That is, he was appointed by King George III to run Virginia. And Virginia, remember, was the largest, oldest, wealthiest, most populous colony of all the 13 colonies. And Lord Dunmore in my childhood was a big villain because he was the guy who was said to have burned down my hometown when he was fighting the Patriots on January 1st, 1776. Now, I started to dig into this and I discovered that, in fact, much of what I learned was not true. And then there was so much that I wasn't taught that had been left completely out of the textbooks and the discussions that I'd had when I was growing up. And so that was the genesis of the book. I realized nobody else had really written about this in depth, and I had to do it.
That's very interesting background on how what inspired you to write about this. So you mentioned Lord Dunmore. So can you tell us a little bit more about his role and how did he go from being George Washington's friend to like one of his most hated enemies? So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this is one of these fascinating, largely untold stories that I dug up. So, Lord Dunmore was a Scottish earl. That is, he was an aristocrat, member of the House of Lords. But like a lot of Scottish aristocrats, he didn't have much money compared to his English peers. So, he had to get a job. And the job he got was to work for the king as a governor of Virginia. Actually, he was first sent to New York as a governor and reluctantly went to Virginia when the Virginia governor at the time died. Now, Dunmore arrived in Virginia at a time when it was largely a tobacco economy where mostly enslaved people were growing tobacco. So 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved people who worked in forced labor camps, which we kind of romantically tend to refer to as plantations. And Dunmore immediately jumped into this, became friends with the Virginia elite, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and others that we know, and bought plantations, bought enslaved people, and became one of the Virginia elite. In fact, he became the guy at the top of the Virginia pyramid, if you will. And everything was going great for Dunmore until around 1775, when suddenly the revolution begins to happen. And in New England, that took the form of violence. But in Virginia, it was much slower to gel into a real effort to separate from Britain.
So did he make certain decisions and his motivations were different? Like, was it something more complex that went through, or like, what were some of his motivations that probably
Yeah.
ended up making him a different character?
Yeah, so Dunmore was he was a fun-loving guy. He liked to ride horses. He liked to hunt. He and Washington got along well because they both liked the outdoors. They also liked land. They also wanted to expand their land holdings so could become wealthier. And in Virginia, there was a great tension between the elite, the gentry, and Britain, because at that time King George would not allow the colonists to move west to establish plantations and cities to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. The king did not want the whites to get involved in a fight with the Indians and create an expensive war. So the king decreed that nobody can move west. Now, this really upset people like Washington, who wanted more land, and they had to go west to get that land. That was, of course, owned by indigenous people. So this became the big tension between Virginia and Britain. Unlike in New England, where the argument was really over tariffs and taxes and tea, in Virginia, it was really over land. And Dunmore was a key guy who, with Washington, tried to get the king to overturn this ban on moving west, but he was unable to do so. And so when the revolution began, Dunmore has to make a choice. Do I side with the patriots and my friends like George Washington, or do I side with the king and the king's troops and fight to keep Virginia in the British Empire? So this was the big issue that he had to face.
Got it. You mentioned Virginia's elite and how he had fit into the circle. So, like the tobacco elite, did they have any fears? Like, what were the influences that they had that influenced their decision to like support independence or not? Like, what were
Right.
some of their factors at play?
The reason that Virginia's elite decided to gamble on independence really had to do with Dunmore's actions. So, what Dunmore did in the beginning of 1775 was very radical. He was faced with patriots who wanted to break with Britain, not necessarily go independent, but they were protesting certain policies, like the policy of not being able to move west. And at first, it was just a peaceful protest, but then when Patrick Henry, who was a Virginia patriot, he convinced the gentry to set up their own militia, their own army, basically. Now, Dunmore is there in Virginia with very few troops or ships. All the troops and ships are in Boston. Boston was the center of the rebellion, right? That's 500 miles to the north. So Dunmore is facing this large rebellion in Virginia, but without the troops to support him. So he made a very radical move, and that was to say, if you attack me in my colonial capital at Williamsburg, then I will free the enslaved people of Virginia, give them arms, and I will turn them into an army that will fight you. This was shocking to white Virginians who really, really feared an uprising of the enslaved people. This was a constant anxiety that whites felt at the time. And Dunmore actually made this threat in April of 1775, and this began to change the attitudes of white Virginians toward the crown.
No, that's a very interesting point, to like threaten to free the enslaved people. There is a point about the Ethiopian Regiment, the first corps of black soldiers in American history. So, like, who were these men, and what drove them to fight?
So Dunmore eventually, in the summer of 1775, was forced to leave Williamsburg. He was hearing rumors of an assassination plot. He had to get out of town. So he did, and he went to the port of Norfolk. Norfolk was the only real city in Virginia. It was the eighth largest port in America at the time, biggest port between Philadelphia and Charleston. It was a very prosperous sea town. And Dunmore decided to make that his base from which to fight the Patriots, who then were in control of Williamsburg. So it really became a fight between the Patriots in Williamsburg and Dunmore and his loyalist friends in Norfolk, in Virginia. So uh, again, not many people that he could get to his side, not many British troops, only a limited number of white loyalists that he could get involved in creating an army for himself. So he decided in November of 1775 that it was time to take the real step, and that is to announce the emancipation of any enslaved person who would fight for the king. So at that point already, there were a lot of Black people, men, women, and children who had arrived in Norfolk seeking liberty. And this emancipation really spurred the rush of enslaved people to come to southeastern Virginia to try and find the kind of liberty that the Patriots themselves claimed to be fighting for. And this was a very radical move. He took these men and formed them into the first Black British Army Corps in history. That is the Ethiopian Regiment. Called it Ethiopian because Ethiopian was a term of respect, one of the few terms of respect that white people gave to Black people in that day. And he actually named it Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. He put his name on it and took hundreds and hundreds of men, gave them arms, made sure they were free, and sent them into battle against the Patriots. in December of 1775. So this was the first time in American history that you have organized black troops fighting organized white troops.
Uh, what do you think his motivations were? Do you think he genuinely cared about the freedom of these enslaved people, or do you think it was more his own desires, to fight and protect his own interests? What do you think? Was it a mix? Was it just his own desires? Like, what's going on, probably?
Well, this is a great question. Historians have long said that Lord Dunmore was simply using these people for his own ends. And there is truth to that. There's also truth to the fact that Abraham Lincoln, who also published later an Emancipation Proclamation, also had political and military goals in mind beyond simple morality. So Dunmore's reasons were many. Yes, he wanted to build an army. The only army he could build was that of enslaved people that he freed. But I think over time, Dunmore, who actually was a slave owner, of course, came to really respect these people in a way that was very unusual for the time. And I think the reason is that Dunmore came from the Scottish Highlands, from this rough, rugged area of mountain men in Scotland. And the Scottish at that time were treated often as barbaric by their English friends. They were treated in a really poor way, and I think Dunmore probably understood the mentality of enslaved Virginians in a way that many other whites did not. So over time, he saw how willing they were to risk their lives simply to arrive behind British lines. They were threatened with torture. They were threatened with imprisonment. Their children and parents were threatened if they left, if they fled their plantations. So they took an enormous risk simply to get to British lines. And once they were there, they proved themselves very willing to learn quickly and to fight in a very brave fashion. And this impressed Dunmore. So I think he evolved as a character and actually came to feel very strongly about the capacity, both intellectual and fighting capacity, of Black Virginians.
Yeah, probably a lot more complex dynamics going on there. Um, you also mentioned the burning of Norfolk, and it's probably described as the revolution's single biggest war crime. Like, can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, this is one of these shocking episodes that for some reason doesn't get a lot of attention from historians. So when I was growing up in Norfolk, my grandparents would take me to the local church. It's called St. Paul's Church. And we would just walk through the churchyard and walk over to one corner. And there in the wall up above was a cannonball stuck in the wall. And the story I was told, and there was actually a plaque there that said, "Fired by Lord Dunmore, January 1st, 1776." In other words, Lord Dunmore and his British fleet that were riding off of Norfolk fired on this defenseless city, burned it to the ground. There was really nothing left of the city. That's the story I was told as a child, and I believed it. But it turns out to be completely false, because what happened was Lord Dunmore was in the harbor with his ships, with the loyalists who were there, trying to escape from the Patriots who had conquered Norfolk in December of 1775. And you have this enormous flotilla with thousands of civilians as well as military people in the harbor. And then you have the Patriots in Norfolk itself. Now, the Patriots got lots of snipers. These are riflemen from Western Virginia to hide in the warehouses on the docks and take pot shots at anybody who came above deck. Now, imagine it's winter. You're crammed on this ship. You can't even go up on deck for fear of being killed. So Dunmore planned an operation to burn the warehouses to prevent the snipers from being able to shoot people on the ships. The operation went off well enough. The wind was such that the city itself didn't catch fire. It was just the warehouses. In fact, it was the Patriots who used this opportunity to set fire to the city. And this was not just done by a few random soldiers. This was actually decreed by people like Thomas Jefferson and other members of the Virginia elite who really didn't like Norfolk because it was a place where there were wealthy Scottish merchants. The enslaved people had somewhat more freedom than those that worked on plantations, and it was seen as a loyalist haven. So they decided to completely annihilate this city and blame it on Dunmore. And they were successful. But we know that it's not true because in 1777, the Virginia Patriots themselves did a very detailed report on what happened that day. And they determined that more than 95% of the buildings in the city were, in fact, destroyed on purpose by the Patriots. So, this is one of the great cover ups of history. And it's important because the destruction of Norfolk, blamed on the British, really spurred a lot of people in the United States or in the colonies to support the patriot cause because they figured if the enemy is burning our cities, we have no choice but to join the patriots to protect our homes. So it had an enormous impact on the decision to go for independence.
Point. And what what do you think? How do you think they were able to cover it up for so long? Like, was it controlling information? Like, how did they manage to do this?
Oh, yes, just like today. They classified the report, whatever version of that they had back then. So this report was very detailed. I mean, they sent a group of people there who basically reconstructed the city on paper and figured out who burned what when. And so it was a very, very well done, accurate data gathering effort. But it didn't give the answer that the Patriots wanted. So this report was hidden for 60 years. We don't know exactly why or who did it, but it did not appear publicly for 60 years when finally it surfaced in the Virginia Assembly and it was published. By then, however, the 19th century, people already thought of Dunmore as the villain. They already had the myth that he had destroyed Norfolk. And even to this day, down to when I was young, and even today, it is still widespread myth that the British were the ones responsible for the greatest single war crime during the American Revolution.
Wow, wow. So I think, do you think it'll be hard for people to change this view, or like, will this myth get busted, or do you think you'll face backlash around this point?
Well, certainly it was shocking to me to learn the truth, but hey, I'm a journalist and I write about history, and my goal here is simply to paint a more accurate picture of what actually happened. And it's really hard to argue with these facts. And what's interesting to me is that they were covered up for so long. And I think the important question is, why did we have to tell a different story? Why couldn't we tell the true story? And I think the reason is obvious. In New England, it was easy to tell a very heroic story of New England farmers fighting British redcoats. In the South, it was more complicated because there were so many enslaved people. It was really difficult to talk about the beginning of the Revolution in Virginia or in the South because it always got wrapped up in the question of slavery. So, as a result, I think it was ignored because it wasn't really convenient. It didn't fit in with our idea of patriots who wanted liberty from the great tyrant, King George III. In Virginia, however, it's clear that the situation was way more interesting, I would say, and more complicated, in that you had almost half of the population seeking liberty, but they were excluded from the American cause, the glorious cause. And so they sought liberty themselves. So you had people on both sides, black and white, fighting for the same reason. They're both fighting for freedom. And in the subsequent decades and centuries, we've forgotten that. And we've only focused on those people who were fighting for liberty on the Patriot side. But I think after 250 years, I think we're mature enough to see the truth and to really recognize the struggle that was really going on in Virginia at that time.
How do you think history or the course of independence, like, how would it have changed? What impact would have had happened if perhaps the cover up was not successful, if they didn't succeed in covering this up?
Right. Um, well, it's certainly an interesting question of what would have happened if the colonies had not chosen independence. And The real key moment was in May of 1776. At that point, a lot of colonies like Pennsylvania, like Maryland, and several others were really on the fence about whether to separate from Britain. And New England was pretty much for independence, but it really was a deadlock. So the Continental Congress, the 13 colonies that were meeting in Philadelphia, really couldn't agree on what to do. Even though the war was going on, there were battles being fought, but nevertheless, people weren't sure if it was the right thing to separate from the British Empire, whether it was really whether it made sense and whether it was even possible, given that the British Empire was the strongest empire on earth at that moment. So, what happened in Virginia is important because Dunmore's threat and his threat to arm and the fact that he armed enslaved Africans and was trying to overturn the Virginia system of slavery really pushed a lot of the gentry and a lot of other whites to support independence. So in May of 1776, they voted unanimously to secede from Britain, to seek independence. And they advised the Continental Congress to do the same. And this broke the deadlock. Since Virginia was the largest, most populous, most important state, it really convinced others that were wavering that it was time to take this big move. So that's why these events that are happening in Virginia are so critical to understanding how the nation was born.
Very interesting. Um, what do you think about these events in 1775? Do you think they have any impact in current debates around urban-rural divide, race, gun control? Do you think like any of these issues in the past have any connections with today's debates?
Um, what surprised me was how relevant this story is to today. Uh, Certainly, gun control is one example. In 1775, Patrick Henry said, "You can talk to people about tariffs and tea, but if you really want to get them on our side, tell them they're going to take our guns." And this is what he put out. Now, it wasn't true. The British had no intention in Virginia of taking weapons away from people, from individuals in any case. But this spread fear throughout Virginia because whites depended on their guns, not so much to hunt or to protect themselves from Indians, but to protect themselves from the enslaved Africans who lived among them. It was the one thing they had to ensure that enslaved Africans would not create a rebellion or insurrection. So the threat of taking away guns became a really major motivation for a lot of small farmers to get out and fight. Very different from New England. So this is one thing that then morphed into what became the Second Amendment, which Patrick Henry was key in drafting. So the issues that we have around guns, whether they should be regulated or not, or how, really goes back to this period in Virginia in the 1770s when there is this threat, and it's all tied up with slavery. The other thing that is kind of you can find the seed to the origin point to is this debate we still have over how powerful the federal government should be. Should it be strong? Should it be weak? How much power should the states have? Who gets to regulate what? I mean, this has been a constant battle. In fact, the Civil War was fought over this question. The Civil War was fought over this question of how much can states decide, and when can the federal government step in and demand that change take place. And this goes back to this time in Virginia, where the Virginians were very wary of a New England-dominated legislature that might insist that slavery be limited or even abandoned. So there was a lot of reason for the Virginians to oppose a strong federal government for many reasons, but slavery was definitely a very, very big piece of that. And the other piece that I think is very relevant to today's headlines, we know about this split between city and country. People who live in the country who tend to support, say, Donald Trump, and those who live in cities who tend to vote more Democratic. this also goes back to this time in Virginia, where Norfolk, for example, was considered a wicked place by a lot of people who lived out in the country, whereas the people that lived in Norfolk looked down on the people who were farmers. So I think this kind of strange split we have in this country, which is unusual, goes back to this conflict that we had about who was supporting the king and who was supporting the patriot cause. And the destruction of Norfolk, I think, is the first time when you really see this anger boiling over into violence against urban areas.
Wow, that's very interesting to see like those historical events and those historical happenings to have like connections to today's times and today's events. I think the book also touches on immigration through the story of the Scottish merchant deportation. So can you tell us more about this? And again, is there any connection to the modern debates?
Yeah, absolutely. The One of the big surprises that I had in doing the research for this book was in discovering that Scottish merchants were really key players in Virginia at that time. So these are the people who would go and buy up tobacco and then ship it to England and to Scotland. And they became incredibly wealthy. And they also were viewed with a lot of distrust by the people who were more of English descent who actually were growing the tobacco, both the elite planters as well as the smaller farmers. And the Scots were middlemen, basically. And they were viewed often as Jews were in that day, and even more recently, as people who were not to be trusted, as an ethnic group that was from the outside, who weren't part of the inner circle of the society. And as a result, the Scots there was a lot of prejudice toward these Scots. And in fact, uh, in the end, in 1776, they were all deported. The Virginia Assembly actually ordered the deportation of anybody who was a Scottish merchant. This had an enormous impact on the economics of Virginia and actually really crippled Virginia for decades to come, arguably, for centuries as well. So this question about who was an American was relevant even then, even before our nation was born. You already had the sense of who was in, who was out, and a lot of uncertainty about how to integrate people who came from different backgrounds.
Wow, and I think that's quite relevant an issue today as well. I think 200 years, 300 years ago, and even now. So your book draws a lot of parallels between the past and the present. Um, when do you think these historical analogies clarify modern issues, and when they might risk oversimplifying things? Like when do we know history can help inform, clarify versus when can we probably oversimplify some complex modern issue? Like it's probably a delicate balance. So what's your view on that?
Well, as Mark Twain said, about statistics, damn statistics. History is like statistics. You can use it to get across anything that you are trying to sell. Um, So all I can do is try and pull it together and tell a story that feels accurate. I'm not trying to sell a thing. I dived into this really thinking I was just going to explore some childhood myths and stories and find out what really happened. And instead, I ended up uncovering what I think are really the seeds of some of the big controversies that we're facing today that are very much in the headlines every day. Gun control, control of the government control of decision making, um, immigration. All of these hot button issues really go back to this time. Now, I want to be careful. I mean, we're in a different time, and actually, I would argue that a lot of people, for example, the January 6th insurrectionists, they saw themselves as as very much like the patriots of 1776, and in many ways, they're right. But we don't live 250 years ago. We have a country that has changed in the way it views slavery, in the way it views ethnicity, in the way it views justice. And so I think it's important to remember that we don't need to copy what happened 250 years ago, but we can make use of the system that was created in order to create the more fair and just society that the founders clearly had in mind when they created the Constitution. So I think history is a really useful tool in understanding how did a problem get started? What was the beginning of it? Because if you're going to solve a problem, you really have to go back to the beginning. You have to deal not with the symptom, but with the cause. And the cause of so many of our issues really began at this critical time when our nation began.
Speaking about events of today, so like there is a political climate that is there in today's world, and how do you ensure this political climate does not influence your work? How do you know, how do you separate science, ideology, and keep a check on biases, you know?
Well, that's a hard task, and the best thing that I've learned to do as a journalist and an author is to be aware of my own prejudices, to be aware of my own story. So, in a way, taking this childhood myth, I mean, this is the story I was raised with, and asking questions and diving into it and learning why is it that I was taught this way. To me, that is essential to be able to understand the world in which I live. So I think there's always bias. I don't think anybody is unbiased, but the best that I can do is to be clear and honest about my biases. Uh, I'm a man who was raised in the South at a time when prejudice was much more open and widespread than it is today. And so I have to be aware of that bias when I'm writing about African Americans. It's critical. And I also can't be afraid to dive into the archives and come back up with something that might make people uncomfortable. Uh, to me, it just makes a story more interesting if it's more accurate. If I can actually show that this person actually said this. Thomas Jefferson actually said that Norfolk must be destroyed. It's really hard to argue with that point if you go back to the historical documents. So for me, the first person, the sourcing of this material is really my guidepost to ensure that I'm sticking as close to a more accurate story as possible.
That's a good process, and I think it's important to make sure the source is accurate. It's very good to know. You also talk about across your work about societies, and here we talked about a cover up that was there. So there is some misinformation, and sometimes societies misuse history as well. So, like, what safeguards could probably be there, to stop the misuse, to stop misinformation in public discourse?
Mm. Well, that's a big question, a bigger question I probably can answer. But when it comes to the American Revolution, I think that the fact that we're now at the 250th anniversary is a great opportunity to pause, to look at what happened then, and to really think about the stories that we tell, and to begin to be more mature, to be more open about discussing the hard parts of this story. I think the French do it with their revolution, and I think it's time for us to do it with ours. Now, this doesn't mean denigrating the founders. Certainly, people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington are very problematic. I mean, they were slave owners. They did not free slaves during their lives. Washington was the only founder who freed his slaves when he died. But these are contradictions that are there, and I think it's okay to discuss them while giving the respect that we should give to those people who were far-seeing enough to create a system that provides us with a chance to create that more just and equal society that we profess to want. So I think it's possible to look at these characters like Lord Dunmore, who was cast as a villain, and instead see him as a more interesting guy who, in some ways, you could argue was as much of a founder as some others, because he's the one who first surfaced this idea of emancipating those people who were enslaved. And it took 90 years for that to come about. But he put the country on a course to doing what it needed to do.
Thing, and to be the first one is probably the hardest thing to do. So after exploring these narratives and these stories, what gives you hope about America's future?
Uh, well, simply that it's possible to go into archives and dig. The fact that we have all this information available. I was doing some of my research during the pandemic, and I was really lucky that I was able to get things online that ordinarily would be hidden away in an archive. So I think that we have this incredible opportunity with the information systems that have come about in the past few decades to uh, tell new kinds of histories. And that to me is inspiring because America is always remaking itself, right? I mean, we pride ourselves on doing things differently in a new and creative way. And history is part of that. So I think we can remake our history. And to me, that's inspiring because it allows us to remake our understanding of who we are and, most importantly, who we want to be. Who do we want to be as a people? What are our values? What matters? How do we create the kind of country that our founders ultimately wanted to see? And that to me is inspiring. The fact that people like you want to talk about history really can make a difference in what kind of society we're going to build tomorrow.
So as America approaches its 250th anniversary, what lessons should we take from history, and more importantly, what do you hope that readers take away, from this new book of yours?
Well, I'd like us to think differently about the American Revolution. I'd like us to see it as this crucible in which the country was created, but also the problems and the differences and the controversies that we face today also were created then. And if we go back to that origin time, that origin point, I think we can start to untangle some of the differences that divide citizens today. So I'm just a big believer in going back to the beginning, going back to the origin, going back to, how did this all get started? I write about archaeology as well, and I'm fascinated with in the Middle East. When did humans first begin to build cities and why? These are these are the important places that we can use history to understand who we are, and to then, have a little bit of a guidepost to make the changes that are necessary in society, and also, most importantly, to have a conversation in our society about these differences, to be able to talk about race and guns and immigration in a way that is informed and respectful so that we can, I think, be more true to the kind of country that we want to be.
Well, what's next for you? Are there like other hidden stories you're eager to uncover? Like what's next?
Uh, well, I have a book idea, but it's just an idea at this point. Right now, I'm still actually giving talks occasionally on my last book, which was about Jerusalem. It's about uh, the 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 efforts to uncover the hidden treasures in Jerusalem that led to the problems today in the Middle East. That is certainly still a very relevant topic given what's going on in Israel and the Palestinian territories today. Um, but mainly, I'm going to be out there and talking about the American Revolution because it is time to, rethink and to, remake our ideas about this country's origins.
Excellent. And where can readers and listeners find a perfect frenzy and follow your work?
Right. Well, you can find a perfect frenzy at your local bookstore. I'm a big believer in your local bookstore. I hope you have one. If you don't, find the one who's closest to you. And of course, you can also find it on the sites like Amazon. It's available as of tomorrow, so I believe they're already shipping the book. And I'm heading out on a book tour starting tomorrow. And you can find the dates for my events at www.andrewlawler.com. Go to the events page. I'll be starting in my hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, tomorrow night at Malaprops, and I'll be going on to Atlanta, to Washington, to parts of Virginia, of course, New York, etc., and on to Massachusetts come April, which will be the anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution. So www.andrewlawler.com has everything you need.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So I'll also add all of this in the show notes and description below. But
Great.
thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us and for sharing about your new book. It was really great chatting with you.
Thank you, Neil. Great questions. I enjoy the talk.